Hello everyone, today we're going to be looking at the work of Molly Farneth and her amazing work, one of the best works in the last 5 years, maybe in my opinion 10 years, called Hegel's Social Ethics, in order to help ourselves get out of our dystopian but enchanted by dystopia as my channel is. Regardless, we are enchanted. We start with the landfill. We are enchanted by the landfill. In my channel, in the cyberpunk world, we are not enchanted by the idea of the forest. Anarcho-primitivists, solar punk, I'm so sorry, but there are toxins in our water. There are microplastics in our water. There is no going back to any form of wondrous utopian world. We must start with the landfill. We must start with an enchantment of the landfill. And how can we build social ethics from within the dystopian nightmare we have built? Well, the first step is to take responsibility, take collective responsibility, to recognize complicity, and to recognize incommensurability, all of which the current milieu of pop psychology and prescriptive intersectionality fails to do, and in doing so, it allows for the worst evils to come in from the back door under the guise of cognitive behavioral therapy or under the guise of virtue signaling ethics, which is evil. Evil because it does the opposite of what it purports to be doing. So, how can we find ourselves out of this nightmare? Well, my friends, this is a really good book and I really recommend you to read it, so I'm going to give a little bit of a reading today for you. Again, another great book that you can read. Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. And there are plenty of other good works that I'm trying to highlight that can find our way out of this dystopian nightmare that we've created, in contrast to the fake utopianness and enchantment of the world that is found in so much of the literature. And you can find that, for example, when all these professors, they end their talks, they always try to end on a good note. Well, here are all these toxins in our water and are these microplastics and all these, we have no idea what kind of hormones that they're releasing in our water, but I'm going to end this lecture on a good note, okay? Which is something that I'm not into. I love cognitive behavioral therapy on an individual basis, but on a collective basis, it works as a kind of ideological covering up that is, in a way, evil. So we do need a collective cognitive behavioral therapy in a way, and that's what my emphasis on collective rituals is about. And how can we go about building those collective rituals? Well, the first step is to recognize our complicity within the collective rituals that we are creating today. So let's go ahead and read a little bit of an excerpt of Molly's amazing work. Thank you for joining me. To identify sacred mystery with every individual experience, every life, giving the word its largest sense, is to arrive at democracy as an ideal, and to accept the difficult obligation to honor others and oneself with something approaching due reverence. This is the kind of spirituality I go for. It's the difference between a empty reading land acknowledgement and a true heart-filled, liver-filled, gut-filled, brain-filled sacrifice to a kind of real land acknowledgement. And if you haven't searched any critiques of modern land acknowledgements, please, I highly recommend that you do so. It is a vision that is wholly religious, though by no means sectarian. Wholly realist in acknowledging the great truth of the centrality of human consciousness, wholly open in that it anticipates and welcomes the disruption of present values in the course of finding truer ones. We cannot avoid the reality that there is no solidarity between the different factions within the forced intersectional perspective of Western idealism of academia. We must first acknowledge that there is no solidarity between the different groups, and our complicity is in fact part of that. Marilyn Robinson: when I was a child, I read books at the dawn of the 19th century. Hegel wondered what would hold this changing society together. Would people take their identities and obligations to be fixed and given, like Antigone and Creon, leading to tragic conflicts, hinting to identitarian essentialism? Would they refuse to listen to one another's claims and criticisms, like faith and enlightenment, turning their differences into impasses? Like when I was in between two different groups of feminists yelling at each other, unable to listen to each other's trauma because they've both moralized the commodification of emotional labor. And this is the central issue with regards to how the neoliberal subjectivity is destroying communities. We must give up these pop psychology idioms. Would they refuse to listen? Would they grasp at abstract and contentless freedom, like the French revolutionaries, replacing one form of domination with another? Yes. The answer is yes. The forms of domination, if you watch my Matrix 4 review, the forms of domination has increased to such an extent that we don't even realize what this domination is. That's what the French Revolution was all about. When Napoleon made specific rioting squares, now we have, Tahrir Square and all these different squares. That is where the revolution can be controlled, and we need to think in that kind of way. If not, what other option was there? The phenomenology of spirit is Hegel's philosophical reply to these questions. The social ethics he proposes for post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment, post-revolutionary moderns. And you can see that Hegel himself became a so-called conservative at the end of his life. Why? A century and a half later, and here we start to revere who I revere the most, Hannah Arendt, the one that the feminists have shunned from their canon, one of the most important female philosophers. She never called herself a philosopher, let's say political theorist. She never called herself a feminist. Hannah Arendt was not a feminist. Why? Hannah Arendt argues that authority had all but faded from modern social and political life. European and American political history, she suggested, was the chronicle of a series of attempts to establish, renew, and or restore authority. But such attempts had always failed. Who can deny, she asked, that the disappearance of practically all traditionally established authorities has been one of the most spectacular characteristics of the modern world? Authority, Arendt contended, is different from power. 2. Authority resides outside of power and beyond those who control or those who hold power. It commands obedience, but it does not require violence or persuasion to produce such obedience. That is what instilling a culture of neoliberal subjectivity through all of our institutions, through our education system, through our psychological system, through our judicial system. That is the role of this progressive capitalism. Progressive capitalism type of authority doesn't need the old school kinds of Putin-like, Iran-like, China-like trying to whip people into shape. It doesn't need to do that. It goes in psychologically. These psychologists, they help us in some way. They help us deal with our personal trauma, but with the same knowledge.
That is, my problem is that the same people who are supposed to be helping us with regards to our addictions are also getting paid by tech industry and other terrible organizations like the military to try to brainwash us in other respects. They try to addict us in other respects.
Talking about painful things that you've learned how to sort of cover over can initially be more painful. But in the interests of working out things that, if not dealt with straightforwardly, are going to come back to bite them, I think that even encouraging a person to talk about something that they're not ready to talk about is counterproductive.
Check out my 2 series on Karl Ratner's work on neoliberal psychology, Unwitting Colonizers, and the other work is Ron Roberts' work on capitalism and psychology. Psychologists are the primary way in which neoliberalism takes over and colonizes our minds by turning all of our social relationships into cost-benefit analyses and claiming that this kind of amygdala-inspired thinking, because I contend that psychologists are all a bunch of people who have psychological problems in themselves. A lot of them do, and that's why they become psychologists. Yeah, there are many good psychologists, and those good psychologists are the ones that are critiquing the established institutional psychologists who are themselves motivated by this amygdalic thinking that contorts and makes camp mentalities. If you watch my Ritual Traces series, it commands obedience, but it does not require violence or persuasion even to produce such obedience. Chomsky says it is manufactured consent. That is the Western way of colonization. This manufactured consent is much more powerful than any type of KGB-inspired Putin trying to do things. I think a lot about Putin today because his troops are on the border of Ukraine right now. Such authority, she suggested, is given. It is a shared standard for belief and action whose bindingness is self-evident to the people who take themselves to be bound by it. In the past, there was such a thing called the great chain of being, and people don't question the great chain of being or the divine right of kings. People don't question, people don't need to rebel. Today, our divine right of kings is the market as the central location, the central God, the central place by which our prayers are answered. And this market logic has impeded into every aspect of our lives. And the reason why I am somebody who is able to see this is because I am an educated, overeducated, too smart for my own good villager that comes from a very small village, and I can see it everywhere. Arendt argued that to acknowledge the demise of authority is to be confronted anew by the elementary problems of human living together. Without a shared standard for belief and action, without authority, we are left with disagreement, conflict, and contestation. We are left with power and persuasion. There's no real universal ideal because all of these different factions are fighting for what they claim to be the truth. But between the cracks of all of these people that are fighting for the truth, there is only one truth, and that is the market relationship between all of these different ideas. Osama bin Laden hates the United States, but would still accept an American dollar. Hegel may have anticipated Arendt's ambivalence about the disappearance of traditionally established authorities, but he also realized that such authority was unsupportable in modern life. Nevertheless, there is something worth calling authority. I think it's kind of a ubiquitous authority, a kind of ubiquitous authority where we can't point our fingers at what it is because we are all neoliberal entrepreneurs, as Foucault says. Nevertheless, there is something worth calling authority. Whatever it is, Hegel thought, it cannot be independent of human beings and their social practices. It cannot stand outside of a disagreement, conflict, and the contest for power. Rather, it has to encompass those things too. Exactly, it takes over everything. Hegel offered an account of the standard of knowledge and ground of authority that arose out of the social practices of people who share a form of life, practices that are incorporated conflict as well as reconciliation. Now, this is where Molly is a real key thinker, just like my work on ritual. I wish I read this work when I was doing my work on ritual. We have no choice but universality. We must start with the landfill. We must start with the universality of the landfill. So, from the universality of the landfill, we create this idea of ritual, or at least this is my understanding or my takeover of Molly's ideas. There is only basically one measurement for quality. On the left hand, we have something akin to addiction. And on the right hand, so the left hand is more individualistic addiction, and on the right hand, we have something more of a collectivist ritual, where we are conscious, where we are in control of our rituals, and on the left hand is the addictions are in control of our lives. And what makes an addictive culture is this amygdalic thinking, this camp mentality, what Paul Gilroy calls camp mentality, as if we are in the camp and there's not enough bread. And soon, more and more, we are becoming this scarcity thinking is taking over our minds, where we need to find bread. Where's the bread? And because we are so focused on bread, we see others as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. And as a result, we create more rituals of camp mentality, more rituals which re-evoke this camp mentality. And this camp mentality, it can be found in psychologists, in lawyers, in police, because they are the people who are dealing with the people on the environs, people who are really truly messed up, the people who don't have any definitions. Yes, for those people, we need to incorporate some definitions, but we cannot universalize those definitions of love that we give to the lowest people in our society, the people who are truly messed up, the people who truly need some signposts. We cannot universalize those ideas. The 5 languages of love, for example. Yes, maybe for people who are really messed up, they need to understand some languages of love. But for people who are normal, quote unquote normal, for people who face normal existential crises, for people who have dealt with their psychological trauma, for those people, we cannot universalize these lowest common denominator healing tools, these pharmacon. Pharmacon can be both a cure and a disease in itself. There is no universal cure. There are no what they're called panacea. We cannot have a panacea. We need to have context-based collective rituals. We need to build those collective rituals. These old rituals like Christmas and all these kind of things are very important for your family, for improving the lives of your community. But right now we live in a world where it's just too much emotional labor and unpaid labor to take up volunteer work. So now we're trying to find something towards reconciliation, from conflict to reconciliation. However, we need conflict. Conflict is a offering, is a possibility, is a ritualistic offering towards the possibility of a public good. Right now, we don't even accept conflict. We cut people off. And by cutting people off, we are unable to listen to worldviews that are outside of our own universality, that are outside of our own worldview. And we need those perspectives that are outside of our worldview from the village, from the people in Mississippi. I don't know. Sorry, I keep pointing to Mississippi as we need the non-ivory tower people to come into the ivory tower and just talk instead of cutting people off and calling them privileged, and this power equals privilege logic, which tells everyone to shut up. And when we tell people to shut up, what happens is people become shut in. And when they become shut in, they create their own polarized echo chambers. You think that just because you cut off a couple people from Twitter, they're not going to become resentful and join, their own version of Twitter, which they already are, just because you are not aware of it. Hegel's view of how these practices of conflict and reconciliation contribute to the standard of knowledge and ground of authority can help us think about the democratic authority. It shifts our attention from legal structures and institutional apparatuses to the relationships and practices of ordinary citizens. Following democratic theorist Bonnie Honig, I use the word citizens and citizenship here to identify people engaged in a particular set of social practices. What is the task of citizenship? Citizenship is learning especially in our post-colonial societies, learning the differences between all the different types of Asians. What are all these languages? What are all these languages that our people are speaking? Maybe I should learn a little bit of Japanese, a little bit of, I don't know, whatever. These people exist in our society, in our post-colonial society. We need to be able to talk to these people. Even just a few words will help me begin to create pathways, connections, just like that neuron looking for connections. Right now, we cut off that neuron from being able to make those connections with people who are completely outside of our worldview, and we go about trying to impose our worldview that are created within these ivory tower structures onto everybody else. Honig argues that we ought to think of citizenship not just as juridical status distributed by states or not distributed by states, but a practice in which denizens, migrants, residents, and their allies hold states accountable for their definitions and distributions of goods, powers, rights, freedoms, privilege, and justice. A citizen is anyone who, in the words of democratic organizer Ernesto Cortés, does the work of a citizen. Wonderful. There are citizens today that are really not citizens, when there are also non-citizens that are doing the work of citizenship. What does it mean? Citizenship, it's the opposite of the commodification of emotional labor, the opposite of the commodification of interpersonal relationships. Citizenship in the ancient Greek societies meant that you need to sacrifice or be willing to sacrifice your life for the ability to vote. Being able to sacrifice your life for being able to vote is very important. Okay, the vote is not a right. In fact, it is a privilege. To vote is a privilege. Not a privilege that can be taken away, but a privilege that only exists when you do some sacrifice, when you do some volunteer work, when you sacrifice your time. Hegel holds that authority properly constituted and rightly understood cannot stand apart from the people, their relationships and their practices. If democratic authority is created and maintained through the rightly ordered relationships and practices of political actors, we need to know more about what those relationships and practices ought to look like. We need to ask, how should citizens structure their relationships? Should they commodify their relationships? Should they look at every interaction as a cost-benefit analysis? I'm talking to this homeless guy. There's no money to be made here. What practices should they cultivate? What are our collective rituals? What are we all cultivating together? What form ought their conflicts take? And how, if at all, might they repair their relationships and communities in the wake of such conflicts? Right now, psychology tells us we have to let go of ideas and people that do not serve us. Guess who was making this argument a long time ago? It was Stefan Molyneux. And guess who was shunning him? It was the left. And today, the left has taken up this Ayn Rand perspective that Stefan Molyneux was arguing a long time ago. You don't know who Stefan Molyneux is? He is the libertarian, so-called white supremacist, so-called right-wing guy. Back in the day, he started a philosophy channel, and he was one of the early philosophy people that was on the internet and grew to become more and more resentful of the popular psychological. So now everybody's cutting each other off. Everybody has this Ayn Randian vision. These are the questions that drive this final chapter. I argue that in a democratically organized and oriented community, citizens' relationships embody reciprocal recognition. Recognition. I don't really like the word reciprocal, but I do love the word recognition. I think it was Simone Weil who said that recognition is the rarest of all gifts. Simone Weil. Citizens treat one another as authoritative and accountable. I suggest that at best, democratic activity fosters relationships of this sort and nurtures the practices that give rise to and sustains them. Such relationships and practices are not conflict averse. In fact, they depend on ongoing contestation and antagonism. I describe the features of this form of conflict and distinguish it from other forms of conflict, including tragedy, culture war, and revolutionary terror. Finally, so she makes this distinction, but I really think we need to take on all forms of conflict. I think that we need to take on the most conflicting versions of conflict as far as we can go, to be as empathetic as possible, to give as much benefit of the doubt as philosopher kings are supposed to do in a democracy. Finally, I turn to the practices of reconciliation that accompany ongoing contestation, including practices of forgiveness embodied in restorative justice. The relationships and practices of democratic actors. Relationships between free and equal citizens must be relationships of reciprocal recognition. The idea of recognition at the heart of this claim, however, is significantly different from that invoked by the politics of recognition debated by democratic theorists in the 1990s and early aughts. At issue in those debates was an identity-based idea of recognition, according to which citizens ought to see and respect one another as bearers of particular identities. I think that the best work on recognition is in the work of Levinas. Failures of recognition on that view result from the refusal to see others for who they really are. Another great work on recognition is Derrida's work on hospitality. As Charles Taylor writes, the thesis is that our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others. And so a person or group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Check out how the democratic media today points at these right-wing people, where Agamben, he argues that there is something, even though I love the concept of masks, and I think that we should all be wearing masks all the time because we do live in a dystopia, and I think you should get yourself a cool looking mask and be part of that dystopic, I really like the gas mask, and you should totally get involved in the cyberpunk regime. Agamben also talks about this idea that there is something weird about all of us muzzling ourselves and not being able to have freedom of movement, and this collective state of emergency that is ongoing right now. What we do is we lump all of these people together, the flat earthers, the anti-maskers, and the anti-vaxxers, right? There's different people, and we put them all together, just like how the right wing does it to the left wing. They just call them all a bunch of, commies, queer commies, rainbow commies. Like, we do that to each other. We typecast one another, and they just keep fighting in this endless war, this American politics that's taken over the rest of the world. It's really disgusting. The politics of recognition was linked to identity politics and the embrace of multiculturalism. Criticism of the politics of recognition has taken over several forms. Nancy Fraser, for example, argues that misrecognition is less a matter of a failure to see and respect people as bearers of identities than a matter of institutional patterns and social relations that perpetuate an unjust distribution of goods of society. Kelly Oliver, meanwhile, rejects the idea of recognition in favor of what she calls witnessing, criticizing Hegelian recognition as dependent on an objectifying gaze. Boo. Oliver argues that our ethical and political responsibilities is to bear witness, to respond to the injustices in which we are implicated. Fine. Closer to the position that I develop here is that of Pachin Markle, who criticizes the politics of recognition's emphasis on fixed and stable identities and instead calls for a politics of acknowledgement in which what is acknowledged is the finitude, contingency, and flux that attend human life. I think that there's a big difference between finitude and contingency. I think that contingency is really integral to this neoliberal subjectivity. Finitude, on the other hand, is something that we can all hold hands regarding. I'm not a big fan of contingency, and you can watch my history of neoliberal subjectivity in my Ritual Traces series so you can get a grasp of that. I don't really think that it's so important to recognize contingency. Some people are contingent, some people are more stable. We just need that a recognition, any form of recognition here. In a sense, we do all need to recognize contingency in the fact that states are always changing. There is no mythical country that always existed. I think that's one of the things that we all kind of need to agree about, that your nation wasn't always there. There was a beginning, a middle, and there will be an end to this nation that you are so aligned to. However, I do think that there needs to be some form of stability within your identity as well. Your cells change every 7 years, but you still have a form of stability. You still have a form of subjectivity within yourself. We are not fully colonized because we still have some idea. We're not fully colonized by neoliberal contingents, intersectional politics of the self, or the self as a firm. We still have an idea, a conception of the self when we heal, when we have some sort of individuation process. There is still, at the end of the day, some form of subjectivity. Perhaps you can call it a spiritual subjectivity or a spiritual relationship. And for that, again, I look to my Ritual Traces series for that. Markel suggests that problems with the politics of recognition stem from ambiguities within Hegel's own idea of recognition. But as I have argued, once Hegel's idea of recognition is understood through the relationship of reciprocal recognition that emerges with confession and forgiveness, it is indeed attentive to these features of human life. Hegel's idea of recognition is relatively consistent in its rejection of a fixed identity, exactly, that precedes action, and it is much closer to Markel's politics of acknowledgement than Markel himself allows. Hegel's idea of recognition is not about the recognition of fixed identities, although, in fact, I think that Hegel does have a lot of fixed identities, the stages of history. He really fixes those identities to be able to climb up the steps of the stages of history. But I guess we can give an Iron Man version of regarding this to Hegel as well. Obviously, we could. But rather about the recognition of subjectivities, read in this way, that is, through the reciprocal recognition that follows confession and forgiveness, rather than through the deformed relationship depicted in the master-slave dialectic. The gap begins to close between Hegel's idea of recognition, Oliver's witnessing, or Markel's acknowledgement. When we recognize one another, I think that those are just kind of academic distinctions. I just go back to Levinas regarding this. When we recognize one another, we bestow a status on one another that at once authorizes us as participants in the world-building activities of making claims and taking action, and admits the likelihood that our claims and actions will be marked by contingency, arbitrariness, and fallibility. And for me, I think that what's more important than any of these things are complicity and incommensurability. These are the markers of subjects, loci of authority and accountability. Once we follow Hegel's idea of recognition through to its culmination in the confession and forgiveness of the wicked and judging consciousness, we see that it does not involve the oppression, domination, or objectification of the other. What is objectification? Is seeing the other as a means to an end. That is the key of objectification. Look at what the intersectional people do with regards to the term objectification. They don't just look at it in this very simple way. They give a whole list of reasons what is objectification. But the only real definition that you need is this one definition, is treating someone as a means to an end, not as an end in themselves. This is why we go from Kant to Hegel. Okay, this is why Hegel today is so necessary. To recognize another person as a subject involves knowing and treating her as authoritative and fit to be held accountable. that is the opposite of this patronizing power equals privilege, racist and sexist power equals privilege narrative. We are able to hold even the person that is powerless accountable. Why? Because we see them as equal. We see them as a human being. From the CEO to the lowly proletariat, that is the way we find everybody as equal. Built into the idea of reciprocal recognition is the acceptance of human fallibility, the perpetuity of difference and contestation, and an implicit challenge to the notion of sovereign agency. I love how she goes with calling this ideal person that we're trying to make. We say that she is both her as authoritative and fit to be accountable. So important. Authority with accountability, with responsibility. Built into the idea of reciprocal recognition is the acceptance of human fallibility, the perpetuity of difference and contestation, and an implicit challenge to the notion of sovereign agency. Whoa, an implicit challenge to the notion of sovereign agency, which means that in a way, that's a real interesting point here. An implicit challenge to the notion of sovereign agency. You see how she's going against, or at least finding the faults with regards to Western Enlightenment thinking? We still haven't gotten over that, this Enlightenment thinking. And in fact, we impose this sovereign agency onto others as well. Each recognizes herself and the other as authoritative and accountable. As a locus of authority, one is authorized to make claims and take action. Each can expect that her voice will be heard and that her proposals and actions will be acknowledged. It's not this can the subaltern speak. The subaltern can speak. It's can the subaltern be listened to. As a locus of authority, moreover, each is authorized to judge the claims and actions of others. She stands in the position of agent and judge. But a citizen's authority cannot be the authority of a lord who rules over others. It is not the status bestowed by the dominant on the dominated. That, as we have seen, is a deficient form of recognition. In relationships of reciprocal recognition, authority is paired with accountability. There is no authority without accountability. And this is not the society that we live in, unfortunately. As a locus of accountability, each citizen is expected to take responsibility for her proposals and actions. Not just their words, not just their cognitive behavioral therapy words. This kind of Roxane Gay, say one thing, do the other, it's okay because power equals privilege. Lameness. The reciprocal recognition that ideally obtains among democratic citizens includes, but is not exhausted by, accountability. Such accountability is not merely backwards looking and episodic. It does not involve only acknowledgement of and punishment for discrete harms. Reciprocal recognition also involves treating others and oneself as finite and fallible. Parties to the relationship at least implicitly acknowledge the perpetual risk of disagreement and conflict. Do we do that in our public sphere today? The need for correction and the vulnerability to one another. In fact, we need to allow for vulnerability for one another. Check out my video on why do men not express their vulnerability. Hint, they do. Our accountability then involves forward-looking moral responsibility under conditions of risk and vulnerability. We are responsible for our claims and actions as we undertake them. Their meaning and effects are not always within our own control, and we may be mistaken or misunderstood. Thus, practices of accountability are ongoing. Because we're mistaken and misunderstood, that doesn't mean that the conversation ends. That's only the beginning of the conversation. Conflict is a ritualistic offering to the possibility of a public good. What do you think Sartre's work is? Sartre's work is a disagreement, a mistake, a misunderstanding of the work of Heidegger. Does that mean his work is BS? For the most part, yes. But no, it doesn't mean it's BS, right? It sparked these conversations with Camus and Sartre. Those existential philosophers, those French existential philosophers, are still need to be read, or at least skimmed through. They must be part and parcel of our relationships with one another as democratic actors. Here it is helpful to think about these practices of accountability, holding, as well as practices of authority granting as rituals or sacramental practices, as Hegel does. Actions that are repeated and even habitual, that symbolize and actualize our reciprocal agency, authority, and accountability. If Hegel is right, that these practices are capable of symbolizing and actualizing, bringing it into being, the self-sufficient ground of authority, then we might shift our model of accountability holding from a punitive to a generative and a restorative one. As Craig Burrowack argues, accountability serves as a positive and productive function in democratic communities. It can improve understanding, transform agendas, build community. It can only do this, however, when accountability is seen as belonging to a broader context of reciprocal recognition, authority, accountability, and democratic change.